The sea is eternal, and as long as the human capacity has allowed us to interact with the sea monsters have haunted our imagination. In every era, every ocean, sailors spun tales of colossal beasts lurking beneath the waves, ready to upend ships and devour the unwary. The legends arose in part from genuine encounters, early seafarers glimpsing unfamiliar creatures, whales spouting geysers of water, immense squid with tentacles breaching the surface, or serpentine oar fish undulating in the depths. And of course, all of these were interpreted as monsters of the deep. The vastness of the ocean, much of it uncharted and perilous, invites both awe and terror. Medieval map-makers famously filled blank corners of the known world with sea serpents and fantastical fish, warnings of the dangers beyond. And indeed, the very phrase, "here be dragons," though apocryphally used, captures how mariners viewed the open sea, a realm of the unknown, where anything was possible. And so today, we talk about the history of sea monsters. Of course, this goes into a bit of the realm of folklore and the human imagination, but it's all good fun, and it's equally as interesting. So, if you'll spend the next hour with me, we can keep an open mind and look back on those old stories. Of course, as is customary, allow me to welcome you to the channel first. Hello to any newcomers, and I will give the customary reminder that this and all the other videos on the channel are completely mid-roll ad-free. You won't get any interruptions. That's because we hate the advertisements as much as you do. Maybe even more. Well, this means we are rather funded by those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the occasional donation through Super Thanks on YouTube and the PayPal link, and also the merch store, but the best thing you can do for us is just to share the video around. Tell your friends, family. Hell, even tell your enemies about it. You might become friends with them. Who knows? In any case, do the whole like, comment, subscribe thing and algorithm stuff. And with all of that said, we may begin our deep dive. You get it? Yeah, you get it. Let's start with the oldest legends. The written record of sea monsters begins with the ancients of the Mediterranean world. That's where mythology and first-hand observation blended freely and openly. Early Greek and Roman literature is rich with oceanic terrors that embody the risks of seafaring, and risky it was indeed. Many people who went out to sea never came back, and good luck finding them. Of course, when we talk about the quintessential sea stories in the classical Mediterranean apparatus, we of course find Homer's Odyssey, composed around the 8th century BCE, and it vividly describes Odysseus, that's the main character, and his harrowing passage between Scylla and Charybdis, monsters personifying a perilous strait. On one side worked Scylla, envisioned as a grotesque, six-headed creature. A quote from the Odyssey goes as following: "She has 12 misshapen feet, 6 necks of the most prodigious length, with a frightful head, and 3 rows of teeth in each, all set very close together, ready to snap up sailors." Doesn't sound like the friendliest character you'd want on the sea, Well, on the other side it wasn't much better. That side waited the Charybdis, a gargantuan whirlpool demon, who, quote, 3 times in the day sucks the sea down, and then, of course, belches it forth again, threatening to engulf entire ships. Now, these were mythical horrors, of course, but they dramatized the very real dangers of navigating the narrow Strait of Messina, with its treacherous reefs and equally dangerous currents. There was even an old saying, to sail between Scylla and Charybdis meant having to choose between two lethal threats, kind of the ancient mariner's version of a rock and a hard place, that kind of thing. So the Greek storytellers and poets peppered the seas with many other formidable beings. The sea god Poseidon's brood included ketos, a general term for any enormous sea creature, and actually the root of our modern word cetacean, which I know it's not a very common word, but, well, maybe you've heard of it. In one famous myth, the vain queen Cassiopeia provoked Poseidon to send a ketos to ravage her kingdom, and her daughter Andromeda was chained as a sacrifice to appease it. The hero Perseus arrives just in time to confront the sea dragon, variously described as a giant fish or serpent, and slays it, rescuing Andromeda. The tale of Perseus and the sea monster became one of antiquity's most enduring legends, replicated in other stories. And if we're going to take just one example, Heracles rescuing Hesione of Troy from a similar sea beast. Now, notably, the word ketos remained, well, loosely defined, kind of on purpose. To the Greeks, it just meant a huge creature of the deep, blurring the line between known animals and legendary monsters. So a whale could be a ketos, or something more sinister could also be a ketos. Well, the Andromeda myth was so influential that later generations claimed physical evidence of it in the real world. Now, the city of Jaffa on the coast of Judea became identified as the site of Andromeda's chaining. In fact, local law insisted the harbor's rocks still bore the marks of her chains. And even more astonishing, in 58 BCE, the Roman official Marcus Aemilius Scaurus exhibited in Rome what he claimed were the fossilized bones of Perseus's monster. According to Pliny the Elder, these gigantic bones, brought from Jaffa, which is called Joppa also, measured over 40 feet long, with ribs taller than an Indian elephant, and a backbone a foot and a half thick. Of course, modern historians, famous for ruining the fun, suspect that they were the remnants of a large whale or marine reptile, which, technically still a sea monster, but in any case to ancient eyes they proved that a ketos once met its end at the hands of a great hero. And of course, confirmation bias, that kind of thing. But outside of myth, ancient naturalists attempted to catalogue marine monsters into more sober terms. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, which was written around 77 CE, faithfully recorded sailors' and travellers' reports of astonishing creatures in distant waters. Pliny writes of whales in the Indian Ocean, 200 cubits long. It's nearly 300 feet, by the way. And other leviathans like the Pristis, a massive whale-like fish said to reach the same 200-cubit length. It was beasts like that he notes could easily smash ships to splinters if they were roused to anger. Even relays that Alexander the Great's naval flotilla encountered a schooling horde of gigantic tunny fish that came on, quote, like an army of enemies in order of battle, nearly swamping the Macedonian ships by sheer force of numbers. Well, in the Atlantic, or the French Ocean as Pliny calls it, one especially fearsome monster was reported. A great whale, dubbed Physeter, that would rise in manner of a column, higher than the sails of the ships, then crash down and spout water, as it were out of a conduit, enough to drown and sink a ship. Well, that's pretty easy to kind of recognize what's going on here, don't you think? An exaggerated description of a surfacing sperm whale. The word Physeter in Greek literally means blowhole or blower. Yet, to Pliny and his readers, this was a literal sea monster, a terrifying giant of the deep, only narrowly avoided by sailors. Pliny's catalogue of marvels goes on. In the Red Sea, he claims whales grew so fat and so lethargic that they could barely move, and the local people used their huge rib bones as roof beams. He recounts the existence of giant eels in the Ganges 30 feet long, and horse-headed and bull-headed fishes that would come ashore to graze like livestock. One particularly colorful story involves a giant octopus that terrorized the coast of Spain. This creature would slink out of the sea at night to raid the fish-pickling vats, of Cartea, making off with its tentacles arms full of stolen catch. When the villagers finally sicked their dogs on the intruder, they were astonished that the monster they cornered, the octopus, was of unmeasurable and incredible size, with a head as large as a wine barrel and tentacles like clubs extending 30 feet long. It took a concerted effort with harpoons and spears to finally kill the beast. Pliny reports that its carcass weighed 700 pounds, and its gaping suckers were large enough to hold several gallons of water each. To the residents of Cartea, this was no ordinary octopus. It was a bona fide sea monster, washed up from the depths. But even more fantastical are these semi-human creatures that ancient writers earnestly included in their natural histories. Pliny asserts that mermaids, which he calls Nereids, by the way, are not a matter of fable but very real. He insists, quote, "For look how painters draw them. So they are indeed." He describes these beings as having the faces and torsos of women, but rough, scaly bodies covered in fish-like scales. According to Pliny, they had been known to come ashore and could be heard crying out in eerie, human-sounding wails when stranded. He even cites what he regards as official proof. A governor of Gaul during Emperor Augustus's reign supposedly wrote to Rome, reporting that several mermaids had been found washed up on the coast, cast upon the sands, lying dead. Pliny details one eyewitness account of a Nereid that was seen dead on a beach, chattering very heavily in a plaintive voice as it passed away. To readers of the natural history, reports like that, coming from Roman governors and embassies, lent an air of credibility to creatures that straddled the line between myth and reality. So, it's from these classical sources that we see two parallel threads in the Mediterranean tradition regarding sea monsters. On one hand, they were mythic beasts like Scylla, Charybdis, and the biblical Leviathan, symbolic embodiments of nature's fury, often serving as foils for heroes or as metaphors for divine chaos. Let's look, for example, in the Hebrew book of Job. Leviathan is depicted as a titanic sea serpent. Quote, "Out of his mouth go burning torches, smoke billows from his nostrils, his breath sets coals ablaze, and flames pour from his mouth." But on the other hand, there were genuine attempts at naturalistic descriptions of very real marine animals, albeit filtered through a lens of awe and limited understanding. A breaching whale or a strange fish seen in distant waters could easily be magnified into a monster in the retelling by observers with no frame of reference. Notably, the ancient Greek term kytos encompassed any large sea creature, whether it was an unknown monster or a known species like a whale. And this linguistic legacy survives in our modern world with that word cetacean for whales, dolphins, and porpoises. But to the Greeks and the Romans, even an ordinary whale was an essentially, a sea monster, just a huge unseen denizen of the deep, inspiring terror and fascination in equal measure. The monsters of the classical Mediterranean, whether products of imagination or exaggerations of reality, they show how our ancestors sought to understand the perils of the sea. They had to give names, faces, and stories to the fear, to the unknown, a human impulse to make it all a little less terrifying, turning it into legend. And of course, for every monster, there was always a hero. So let's move on a little bit chronologically. We transition into the Middle Ages, where the torch of maritime lore passed from Mediterranean civilizations to the Norse, the Celtic, and even the Arabic seafarers who pushed into the Atlantic and beyond. The medieval imagination mingled classical influences with new folkloric elements, creating a bestiary of sea monsters in sailors' yarns, religious writings, and even the odd travelogue from a few adventurers and explorers. And one of the era's most famous ocean legends comes from Navigatio Sancti Brendani, the voyage of St. Brendan, an Irish monk said to have sailed the North Atlantic around the 6th century. In this allegorical tale, preserved in Latin around the 8th to 9th centuries, Brendan and his monks land on what they believe is a lush deserted island to celebrate Easter. But, to their horror, the island begins to move. They had actually landed on the back of a gargantuan sea creature called Jasconius. The voyagers scramble back to their boat as the great beast begins to submerge. The story of the island fish delighted medieval audiences, and it was not unique either. It echoes earlier tales and perhaps real experiences of sailors who accidentally anchored on sleeping whales or other leviathans. The Navigatio's popularity spread the notion that the ocean hid creatures so large that they could masquerade as land. And indeed, the same motive appears in Arabic lore and later Viking storytelling, suggesting a shared pan-oceanic legend, always cautionary, teaching that not everything that appears safe in the sea can be trusted. But what about the North European seafarers, especially the Norse? Well, they added their own distinctive monsters to the canon. The Norse sagas and medieval Scandinavian texts contain references to prodigious sea serpents and kraken-like beasts in the cold northern waters. First of all, and pretty quintessential, is Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent of Viking myth, said to be so immense that it encircled the entire world at the ocean's edge, biting its own tail, a clearly mythic symbol, yet one that resonated with the idea of unfathomably large creatures in the sea. More concrete, though, is the Hafgufa, described in a Norwegian work of the 13th century known as King's Mirror. Now, the King's Mirror takes a pseudo-scientific and didactic tone, as a father teaches his son about natural wonders. It recounts the Hafgufa as a colossal fish or whale that is seldom seen, always in the same two places, leading the narrator to conclude that only two existed in the world. This beast was so large, it could be mistaken for an island when surfaced. The text soberly explains the Hafgufa's extraordinary feeding method. It would belch up a great deal of bait, emitting an irresistible perfume or chum that lured other fish into its gaping maw, and then it would just clamp its jaws shut, consuming all within all at once, including, well, presumably, any ship unlucky to drift between its jaws. The matter-of-fact tone of the account is pretty striking, too. It treats the half-goofer not as a fanciful fable, but as one of the many whales or great fishes that a well-informed mariner should know about. So one might suspect that actual observations of whale behavior, perhaps the way a whale might lunge, feed with mouth agape, or the phenomena of sea vapors and mirages around whale gatherings, underlie these legends, later corroborated by modern scientists who suggest trap-feeding whales could explain the half-goofer tale. Nevertheless, to a 13th century audience, with a little less scientific and naturalist knowledge, the half-goofer was simply the biggest monster of the northern seas, a natural marvel that inspired both wonder and dread. Throughout medieval Europe, a strong thread of Christian symbolism also intertwined with sea monster lore, and this is what brings us to bestiaries. Now, you might have heard that word. We have it in a few modern contexts, especially in fantasy book works or that sort of thing. But if you don't know, basically a bestiary was an illustrated compendia of real but also imagined animals. For example, they were often ones described with moral lessons to creatures of the deep, and the whale is one of them, sometimes allegorized as the devil or as sin. Just as a whale could lure a fish into its mouth and swallow them, so too could the devil lure souls into damnation. And one famous bestiary creature, the aspidocolon, or the asp turtle, was depicted as an island-like turtle or whale that deceived sailors into landing on its back before dragging them to the bottom, essentially another variant of St. Brendan's Jasconius. Such stories straddled the line between cautionary folklore and spiritual allegory. The sea was a place of mystery, created by God, populated with creatures that could test one's faith, or even punish the unwary. Well, biblical influences were significant too. The Old Testament's Leviathan, a terrifying primordial sea serpent, it was frequently referenced in medieval texts as the archetype of the monstrous fish. Church scholars debated Leviathan's nature. Was it a crocodile? A whale in a literal sense? Or was it a literal demon of the ocean? Who knows? Arguments abound, I'm sure. But they all agreed on one thing. It symbolized the untamable chaos of the deep. And it's little wonder that map markers in this era, such as the markers of the famous Hereford Mappa Mundi around 1300, sketched sea monsters at the ocean margins, including weird hybrid beasts or monstrous whale serpents to warn the perils awaiting beyond the known world. Meanwhile, in the Islamic Golden Age, Arabic and Persian explorers were venturing into the Indian Ocean, and they recorded their own encounters and tales of marine monstrosities. There's a remarkable 10th century collection known as Kitab Ajaib al-Hind, or the Book of the Wonders of India, Hind, of course, being India. This was written by Buzurg ibn Shahriyar, and it offers a glimpse into the folklore of sailors from the Red Sea all the way to China. Now, as for Buzurg, he was a shipmaster from Siraf, which is in modern-day Iran, who compiled maritime anecdotes both factual and fanciful. Figuring out which one is which, perhaps that's up to the reader. Among the 136 stories in his book are those of enormous sea creatures that stretch credulity. He relates the saga of a giant lobster that seized a ship's anchor and towed the entire vessel for days. Other entries describe fearsome mermaids and sea dragons, and even a particular race of humanoid marine hybrids, creatures born of human fathers and fish mothers, who could intermarry with human society, yet possessed scaly tails and flippers to swim as easily as a fish did. Well, I suppose everybody has their preferences, far be it for me to judge. Well, in Buzurg's world, sea serpents were said to grow so large that they could devour oxen, and island-sized birds, the legendary rook or roc, could snatch elephants from the shore. Clearly many of these tales are enriched by generations of storytelling. I mean, come on, elephants, really? Still, the inclusion of such accounts in a trader's compendium suggests that sailors in the Indian Ocean, much like their European counterparts, swap stories in harbors and marketplaces about the terrifying wonders that they had supposedly seen. Importantly, Buzurg's narratives show how the global sea monster motive had become by the Middle Ages. Persian Gulf mariners spoke of mermaids and sea serpents in much the same breath as a Norse skipper or an Irish monk might, albeit in different languages and cultural expressions. So the ocean's vast unknowns always inspired similar imaginations across cultural lines. But by the late medieval period into the Renaissance, as European exploration accelerated, these long-standing myths began to encounter a few new realities. Old charts that warned, "Here be monsters," gradually gave way to more scientific mapping. But not before a flourish of sea monster iconography in the 15th and 16th centuries, that is. The great era of the voyages of discovery would soon test which monsters were real and which were merely figments of an imagination out on a very long and boring night at sea. So here we are at the dawn of the age of exploration, and that's about the 15th to the 17th centuries. At this time, well, people were getting a little bit more enlightened, but not quite enlightened enough to banish the sea monsters. On the contrary, the legends spread the new oceans and lent them a veneer of eyewitness credibility from famous explorers. As European ships sailed into uncharted waters, sailors often interpreted unfamiliar marine animals through the lens of old monster tales, sometimes embellishing them in the retelling. Mapmakers of the Renaissance eagerly incorporated these reports into their works. The most influential? Well, arguably Swedish cleric Olaus Magnus, whose 1539 map Carta Marina, which map of the ocean, you know. Carta is, of course, map, and marina being ocean. That's where we get the word cartographer from, by the way. In any case, I digress. The 1539 map of Carta Marina. It was among the first detailed maps of northern Europe, and featured a pretty good variety of sea monsters in the margins. In Magnus's accompanying book, History of the Northern Peoples, written in 1555, he describes the Norwegian sea orm, basically a serpent-like leviathan, said to haunt the waters off Bergen. Based on sailor testimonies, Magnus reported the sea orm to be 200 feet long and 20 feet thick. That's pretty thick. Thick with 2 C's, even. About the length of 5 ships, and about as wide as one, by the way. He wrote that this titanic serpent could raise its neck like a mast alongside a ship and even wrap itself around the entire vessel. In one engraving on the Carta Marina, a red-hued serpent is shown coiled around a ship's hull, about to crush it. Magnus noted that the monster was reputed to be so voracious it could slither onto land at night to devour livestock, and then slip back into the sea by day. While such claims stretch belief, Magnus's accounts became the reference point for sea serpent lore for the next 2 centuries. Later naturalists and clergymen, including the Bishop of Bergen, Eric Pontoppidan, in the 1750s, continued to affirm the existence of this great sea serpent based on full and sufficient evidence from credible and experienced fishermen. Well, that's all the evidence we need, I suppose. There's just lots of people saying the same thing, so, well. In effect, right, all jokes aside, okay, in effect, Magnus transformed Scandinavian monster lore into something almost canonical in early scientific literature. And, well, of course, we're a little bit more enlightened now, but in any case, the sea orm has still maintained its lasting fame. Well, alongside monstrous serpents, Renaissance maps and books depicted creatures labeled as kraken, that is, giant, tentacled beasts, and various hybrids copied from medieval encyclopedias. Now, interestingly, Olaus Magnus and his contemporaries often drew these monsters with features resembling known animals. One can discern whale-like blowholes or fish-like fins in their illustrations. And this suggests that real sightings were being creatively interpreted. Magnus even included a creature he called the Physeter, and that comes from the same root as Pliny's Physeter, by the way, describing it as a whale-like monster 200 feet long with a forked tail, finned feet, and a face that looked like a boar, actually. Well, the most horrifying part was the fact it could smash up ships with its tail. Modern analysts recognize in this description the influence of actual whale behavior, of course, and anatomy too, exaggerated by a little bit of fear, of course. And indeed many of Magnus's supposed monsters were likely misidentified whales, seals, or even walruses, which, up in his neck of the woods, there certainly are plenty of them. Of course, these were seen fleetingly by mariners who had no other context. And of course, like I said, those lonely nights at sea where it's so quiet, boring, or those little gaps in the silence and all the rest, well, imagination has a funny way of filling the silence in. But to the Renaissance reader, these were bona fide sea monsters, backed up by the authority of learned men and the testimonies of sailors. And after all, the sailors were the ones who were out there every day, so well, it gives them a bit of credence, I suppose, especially when so many are coming back with the same or similar stories. Now, will lead us on to the next section right here, the great transoceanic exploration. And these explorers also contributed their own stories to sea monster lore, sometimes inadvertently. Christopher Columbus, we all know him, right? During his voyages to the New World, he frequently noted natural curiosities in his log that later took on legendary status. In January of 1493, off the coast of what is now the Dominican Republic, Columbus recorded encountering 3 mermaids that rose high out of the water. But far from being entranced, the Admiral dryly remarked that these mermaids were, quote, not half as beautiful as they are said to be, for their faces had some masculine traits. Well, who knows, maybe he saw a merman. Who knows? There's got to be mermen, that's for sure. Leave a comment for the mermen. Are there any mermen out there listening? Maybe. Well, we do know that Columbus was almost certainly describing manatees, though. Large, slow-moving marine animals with round faces and paddle-like tails. His disappointment in their looks is almost, well, it's pretty funny in retrospect, I think. But it does show how strong the mermaid expectation was. Columbus, steeped in sailor lore, knew about sirens and mermaids from classical myth and medieval stories, so when he saw unfamiliar creatures bobbing about in the Wales, he interpreted them through that lens, and found that the reality was quite wanting compared to the fantasy. Well, this famous mermaid sighting of Columbus is often cited as the first written record of manatees in the Americas, showing how real animals underpinned many monster sightings once again. But nonetheless, Columbus's report at the time added credibility to mermaid legends for those back in Europe. Of course, if you're willing to believe it, you'll take any evidence. Nonetheless, let's move on. Oh, and just quickly, Columbus, after all, was the great admiral of the ocean sea, confirming that something like the fabled siren even existed, even uglier than imagined, coming from him. Well, people were more willing to believe it. It's the bias of authority, I suppose. In any case, not long after Columbus, another explorer made an even more detailed mermaid report, and that was Henry Hudson, the English navigator searching for the Northwest Passage, who wrote in his log on June 15th, 1608, that some of his crew encountered a mermaid off the coast of Novaya Zemlya in the Arctic. According to Hudson's journal as preserved by others, one sailor cried out, and others rushed over in time to see a creature swimming close to the ship's side, looking earnestly upon the men. The entry describes the being from the waist up as a woman with very white skin and long black hair, with the back and breasts of a female human of normal size. And as they watched in astonishment, the mermaid was overturned by a wave, revealing her lower half, which was the tail of a porpoise speckled like mackerel. This remarkably specific description, down to the mermaid's spotted fish tail, has the ring of an earnest observation, yet clearly no real mermaid was at play. Hudson's crew likely saw a large seal or walrus, creatures which in certain lighting or posture could vaguely resemble a human form, if we're having a little bit of generous interpretation. Or perhaps it was a school of fish that gave the illusion of a single form. For all we don't know. But Hudson's status as a respected explorer once again gave the account weight, just as Columbus's status gave his account weight. So here was a case not of a second-hand fable, but an explorer's log attesting to merfolk sighting in the cold northern waters. It's notable that in Hudson's time, as in Columbus's, the default interpretation for any vaguely humanoid-seeming sea animal was mermaid. The classical notion of Nereids and medieval lore of sirens was so ingrained that even pragmatic navigators reached for those labels. Reports like Hudson's kept mermaid lore alive and well through the 17th century. Naturalists of the day seriously debated the existence of mermaids. And, well, some even claimed they preserved specimens, which later turned out to be manatee or ray carcasses, or even deliberate fakes. In any case, it was certainly an era when the boundaries of knowledge were expanding. Yet the old legends, rather than vanish, just adapted. During the same period, European ships ventured into the Pacific and Indian Oceans for the first time, encountering unfamiliar ecosystems and peoples. They brought back new monster tales as well. Dutch sailors rounding the Cape of Good Hope spoke of a giant sea penguin or humanoid sea creature sighted in the distance. Portuguese explorers in the Indian Ocean heard local stories of the Makara, excuse me, the Hindu beast often depicted with an elephant's trunk and a fish's body. And undoubtedly they saw real creatures like dugongs, relatives of manatees, by the way, which have fed mermaid myths around East Africa and India. One 16th century Portuguese report tells of a, quote, fish woman captured in the East Indies, likely a misidentified marine animal, or a fabricated tale to amuse the audiences back home. As Europe's global reach grew, its repository of sea monster anecdotes and lore absorbed influences from all corners. The Japanese had legends of dragons and long-necked turtles. The Indonesians down in Java had tales of the Naga serpent, and the African coastal myths had fearsome mermen too. By the 17th century, scholars like Athanasius Kircher, which is just a great name, isn't it? Athanasius, well, they tried to compile and reconcile these stories in compendiums, straddling the line between science and wonder. And so the age of exploration did not dispel the sea monsters of old, rather it just gathered them all in one place, expanded their geography, and every now and then gave them new names. But it also planted the seeds of skepticism. The more widely traveled observers became, the more they noticed that many monsters actually resembled mundane sea creatures when seen clearly. In 1600, an English sailor might still swear by the sea serpent of Norway or the mermaids of the Arctic. But by 1700, some natural philosophers were beginning to seek more rational explanations. And so the stage was set for the Enlightenment. And this was a time when sea monsters would be scrutinized under the light of new scientific empiricism. So entering the 18th and 19th centuries, the general tone in discussing sea monsters shifted gradually from credulous marvel to scientific curiosity, and sometimes outright skepticism. Enlightenment-era naturalists, armed with new tools of taxonomy and a growing specimen record of real marine animals, began examining legendary monster reports with a more critical eye. Now, this is not to say that the era of sea monsters has ended. Neither did it mean that the sightings had ended either. Paradoxically, the 17 and 1800s saw an uptick in reported encounters, especially with that archetypal great sea serpent. Learned societies and naval institutions found themselves having to determine if such creatures truly existed, as each new sighting stirred public fascination. And one pretty pivotal account came from the remote seas off Greenland in 1734. It was there when Hans Egede, a Lutheran missionary, and his crew had a spine-tingling encounter that would become a cornerstone of sea serpent lore. Egede's ship was sailing the Davis Strait when a crewman cried out at the sight of an immense shape in the water. In his journal, later published in Copenhagen, he described, quote, a very terrible sea animal that rose out of the sea, towering so high that its head overtopped the ship's crow's nest. The monster had, by Egede's account, a long snout and blue water like a whale, with broad flippers or fins on both sides. Its skin was rough and uneven. Crucially, its lower body remained beneath the waves, but appeared serpent-like. At one point the creature lifted its tail, which Egede said was as long as the whole ship again, far behind the portion of its body near the hull. After several minutes, this leviathan monster submerged, and then disappeared. Egede's narrative, disseminated in multiple languages, excited Europeans. Here was a pious and credible clergyman providing a detailed description of a real sea serpent. Not some second-hand myth, but an eyewitness report, in a known location and with a precise time. And this, of course, spurred debate. Some naturalists theorized Egede saw a giant squid or a new species of enormous seal. Others insisted it was proof of that sea orm of Olaus Magnus and the Leviathan of Scripture being real, merely just waiting to be classified. Over a century later, modern scientists would reanalyze Eggede's report and even suggest that what Paul Eggede, Hans' son who actually witnessed it, saw might have been an unusually large whale, perhaps a lone male of the species in an aroused state, mistaking its visible genitalia for a serpent's tail. Well, that rather humorous hypothesis aside, the most dreadful monster of Greenland entered the annals as a genuine sighting, and genuine sightings demand explanation. In the wake of this encounter, the great sea serpent became a subject of intense popular and scientific interest. The late 18th and early 19th centuries, especially in the North Atlantic and New England, brought a flurry of serpent sightings, and each one prompted new investigation. One of the most celebrated ones occurred in 1817 in Gloucester, Massachusetts. During that summer, dozens of townspeople, fishermen, and sea captains reported seeing the same enormous serpentine creature in the harbor and offshore. The creature was described as long and snake-like, with humps that rose above the water. A local scientific group, the Linnean Society of New England, took these reports seriously and gathered affidavits from witnesses. A Cape Ann fisherman named Matthew Gaffney gave a particularly vivid statement. While in his boat, he observed, quote, "a strange marine animal resembling a serpent, with a head as large as a 4-gallon keg and body as thick as a barrel." Gaffney estimated the beast to be 30 to 50 feet long, rather 40 to 50 feet long, and noted that it moved swiftly, about 20 to 30 miles per hour, at least by his reckoning. When he nervously fired his musket at it, the creature reportedly darted directly toward his skiff before diving underwater and reappearing at a safe distance. Although no conclusive physical evidence of the Gloucester sea serpent was found, the sheer volume of eyewitnesses gave the account plausibility at the time. Newspapers nationwide picked up the story, and the sea serpent briefly became an American sensation. Skeptics suggested it was merely a school of porpoises swimming in line, or an overgrown eel, perhaps. But many New Englanders remained convinced that something unknown lurked in their waters. In any case, it remains a classical cryptozoological lore case, a pre-modern monster panic, scrutinized by early scientists, but still unresolved. Well, the crescendo of sea serpent mania arguably peaked with naval encounters in the 1840s. In August of 1848, the British Royal Navy ship HMS Daedalus was sailing in the South Atlantic, about 300 miles off the coast of West Africa, when its captain and several officers beheld an extraordinary creature passing alongside. Captain Peter McCuhay later filed an official report to the Admiralty describing an enormous serpent cruising with its head and perhaps 4 feet of neck above the water, and an undulating body trailing an estimated 60 feet behind. He noted that the animal was moving at a steady 15 miles per hour and kept pace with the ship for at least 20 minutes in clear view. The creature was brownish, with a slight mane or crest of something like seaweed along its back. McCuhay was adamant that it was not a whale, it was not a seal, or any known animal. The head was, quote, "without a doubt that of a snake," and the diameter of the body about 15 inches, considerably thinner in proportion than any whale. This account coming from a seasoned naval officer in an official capacity, caused a stir in Victorian scientific circles. The famed anatomist Sir Richard Owen, who, by the way, and here's a bit of trivia for you, he was the one who actually coined the term dinosaur. Sir Richard Owen, remember that? Dinosaur. Well, he publicly argued that Daedalus monster must have been an errant seal, or just a large form of snake mackerel, while others proposed a giant kelp or optical illusion. But many in the public were thrilled to think that a veritable sea serpent had finally been observed by a gentleman of standing. The Royal Navy experienced a few similar reports around that time. For instance, in 1848, a crew of the HMS Plumper off Portugal saw a long black creature with a sharp head and a mane, which closely mirrors the Daedalus sighting. Even into the 1870s and 80s, individual captains and crews, such as Captain R.J. Kringle of the steamship Umfuli in 1893, continued to describe huge, unknown marine animals, suggesting that the phenomenon, whatever it was, persisted. By the late 19th century, science had made great strides in understanding ocean life. Yet the depths still held secrets. Each monster report was met with a mix of enthusiasm but also skepticism. Interestingly, it was around this time that the real monsters were being confirmed. The giant squid, long thought to be mere sailors' talk of a kraken, was finally documented when large carcasses washed up in Newfoundland and Labrador in the 1870s. The realization that a squid over 40 feet long truly existed gave some credence to older tales of tentacled krakens pulling down ships. Though in reality, giant squids are deep-sea dwellers, and they're pretty unlikely to come up far enough to attack vessels. Naturalists like Anthony Cornelius Odemans compiled hundreds of sea serpent reports in 1892, and even published a treatise proposing an unknown long-necked seal might explain them all. Well, the plesiosaur hypothesis was floated by others. Perhaps some Cretaceous-era marine reptile had survived in the ocean's depths and was occasionally seen at the surface. Of course, these ideas straddled the line between rigorous zoology and the nascent field of cryptozoology. It was an era caught between wonder and empiricism. For every hard-headed skeptic dismissing monster sightings as misidentified known animals, there was a respected scientist or explorer willing to believe wholeheartedly that something was still out there. I suppose it's pretty emblematic of the human experience, right? Like I said before, imagination fills those gaps, but the mind wanders off, especially in those times when things didn't quite have explanations yet. Is it bad? Not really. It just is what it is, isn't it? And I think that when you look at the end of this long tradition, we certainly have the benefit of hindsight and science, but that doesn't mean that it's over. The allure of the sea monster still remains. After all, very little of the ocean floor is mapped. You look at things like the Hadal Zone, it's, well, I could use the word terrifying, to be honest with you. Who knows what's down there? There's even land species that we're discovering now. Even in 2025, discovering new species out there in the Amazon and jungles of Africa and all the rest. Who knows what's at the bottom of the ocean? Oof. In any case, it certainly reminds us that the ocean, which covers 70% of the planet, by the way, were and are ecosystems where human imaginations can still find dragons either to slay or perhaps sometimes to befriend. And so today, while modern sailors are navigating with GPS, sonar, all the modern goodies of technology, you can certainly imagine that on that lonely night watch, that someone might peer out into that luminescent foam and wonder if that fleeting shadow belonged to something unfathomable. The sea, as the saying goes, never tells all of its secrets. And well, in our collective imagination at least, the sea monsters will continue to swim just below the surface. And I think that's probably where we can end it for today. I'm going to thank my top tier patrons, which I will read out now, which were responsible for your ad-free viewing. We have Kimberly, Christine, Sally Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Moji, 11, Alison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katie P, Lovely, Boma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolf's Bane, Dude, Brinny, Aidan, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, and Alexa. Thank you so much. And yeah, that's it from me tonight. You're welcome to go through the playlist, watch another video, put on a 9-hour one to sleep. Wherever you are in the world, thank you very much for listening. Alright, lots of love to you all, and I will see you next time. Farewell for now.